Hey guys, how's it going? Jonathan Lipp here from the Big Apple Film Festival. Here we are again at another episode of BAFF Chats. We're hanging out here on 46th Street, Midtown Manhattan, right at the heart of the theater district. I'm hanging out today with Larry Brand, who is an exceptional screenwriter and filmmaker who had a movie called The Girl on the Train, which screened at the Big Apple Film Festival a few years back. So first off, you can tell us a little about The Girl on the Train.
Wow, that's a pretty open-ended question. I think we were going to talk about screenwriting, right?
Yes.
And that's an interesting one. It was a script I'd written or started to write about 15 years prior. And it's one of the few scripts that I just put down because I couldn't solve some problems with it. I had a second draft, a third draft, and I just wasn't making it. And I kind of put it down. And then we had an option to do a film in New York about 3 years ago. And I just there's something about it that kind of, it kept gnawing at me. Why didn't I finish that? And I found it. I had it on an old chip. It was prior to it was like 4 generations back on computers, and I had it on an old floppy, and I figured out a way to get it on my new computer. I looked at it, and I married it with these themes that I'd been working on recently, and so it was one script that took me 15 years to write in a sense, because I'd started it, and then I put it down, and I had these other ideas, and so it's an unusual circumstance where something takes that long to marinate. Normally, I think most writers will write a script in kind of a condensed time framework. So that one is more of an unusual circumstance where it really I didn't have the ideas. I had the characters and the plot. I didn't have the ideas yet, and the ideas are to me as important as the story itself.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've always loved the most about a great screenplay. Now, this is just a personal thing for me. I think great characters are absolutely essential. And when I look back at some of the greatest movies I've ever seen, Rocky and Forrest Gump and Good Will Hunting, these movies have such great characters. How, as a screenwriter, do you develop such amazing characters that you just can't look away?
Well, I think you have to inhabit the character from inside. I think when you see movies that read to you as false, or characters that read to you as false, if you're watching a picture and you don't buy it, even if you can't articulate why, generally I think the problem is that the writer is not really putting himself in that character, in that time, in that moment, in that situation. And it can be a failure of imagination. It's simply, the trick is really to, if you're not buying something, it's because you kind of intuitively understand the character wouldn't do that in that scene, in that scenario, in that framework. And I think for me, I'm kind of a method writer. I try to imagine the characters. If I were going to act these roles, what would be interesting to me? And a lot of great directors, Clint Eastwood, started out as actors and became really great directors. And I think I was never destined to be a great actor. I played supporting roles in my Roger Corman pictures. But one of the things it did was it gave me the insight into what it is on the other side of the camera. So when I write characters, I'm a little bit more concerned with them being interesting and intriguing, and also being honest to where they are and what they're doing at that moment. And one thing I would recommend to filmmakers starting out is to do everything, to act in your own movies and light them and edit them or edit other people's movies, work in other people's movies. It's really very instructive. Back in the 70s, the probably the greatest age of American filmmaking, these guys were doing. Jack Nicholson started out as a writer. He was writing movies back in the 60s. Oh yeah, and they would all do. So what about getting Nicholson? Maybe stick him in front of a camera, see if he can act. And I think there was a sense of camaraderie and a sense of filmmaking that you just wanted to be on the set. You didn't matter what you did. You wanted to try everything out, and you found your own center of gravity. And for me, writing was always stronger than anything else I could do. And then the directing kind of evolved from that.
You had mentioned about the Roger Corman films that you had done earlier on. I'm a big fan of those films. I'm a huge horror fan. Love Roger Corman. Love Lloyd Kaufman. Love Trauma. All that kind of stuff. For people out there that have seen some of the great Roger Corman films, how much did Roger Corman prepare you to become a screenwriter?
Well, if you've never been to film school, Roger becomes your film school. And I was, I guess, I don't know, second, third generation of filmmakers to come out of Roger. There's probably another couple since. I was there in the late 80s, early 90s. When you've directed your first Roger Corman movie, you will never be intimidated again in your life as a filmmaker. I don't care what the budget is, how many people you got to deal with. If you've made a movie in 17 days that looks like a real movie, and you've pointed the camera in the right direction, and it gives you a sense of confidence in your technical. I mean, you may not be a brilliant creative guy, you may not be an artist, but at the very least you will have learned how to make a movie in a way that I don't know that film school can ever do. So Roger is very hands off. In fact, I'd had some success as a writer. I had a couple of movies made, and on bigger budget movies. So my manager went to Roger the idea that I would direct The Drifter, which I did, and so they kind of said, well, let's give him a shot. That's the thing about Roger. Yeah, how bad could it be? His way of firing people. If he had somebody incompetent that was working in the office, it was like driving the company underwater. He would give him a movie to direct. That was his way of kissing you off. It's like, okay, we'll give her a movie and we'll get her out of it. And it actually happened with at least one person I'm aware of, probably quite a few. So he knew what his market was. He knew he was going to sell the movies. He wasn't particularly uptight about, as long as it fit a certain formula to him, you could sneak in a movie that meant something to you. So even though The Drifter was, it had certain conventions that, you had to have a certain amount of nudity, although we had pretty minimal. I was always gave them fits because I didn't really like to do nudity. But, it had a certain amount of violence, had a certain amount of intrigue, and then you could kind of sneak in what, in my view, was a serious movie about serious themes, as long as it fit the formula for Roger. And Roger was always very open to being creative, and he didn't interfere very much, which was terrific, much less than the conventional bigger studios.
Right. I'm a huge fan of the Halloween series. Sure. Diehard Halloween fan. Right. Halloween Resurrection was a film that Larry had written, and when you look at these sort of genre horror films, the big thing, I guess, is blood and sex, etc. And how do you develop characters that we really love and care about, and bring in all of those other elements, so that we're sort of engrossed in the whole thing, the characters and the genre?
Well, Halloween Resurrection was a little bit different for me. It was a job that I was hired to do. I mean, the idea was mine. I came up with the idea and I pitched the idea, and it went on from there. But it was very much a studio movie, and you have a few more hands involved in the process than I generally like to work. For me, people can judge whether or not the characters in Halloween fit the bill that you're describing. Yeah. But when I do movies that are a little bit more personal, like Christina or Girl on the Train, or even The Drifter, my first Corman movie, the characters come first. If you think about one of the greatest horror movies of all time, The Exorcist. Yeah. The Exorcist isn't great because of the special effects. I mean, they were very effective in their time. If you look at the movie today, maybe less so, but what holds up and what is still terrific is the reality of the characters. When this little girl begins acting strangely, they don't go to an exorcist, they don't go to a witch doctor, a voodoo expert. They go to a doctor. They do what any parent would do. They go to a doctor, they go to a psychiatrist, they do everything they possibly can. That's a last resort, and even there they don't really quite believe it. It's just kind of maybe that'll jolt her. So they're acting like real people in the real world, and the brilliance of that movie is not the special effects, it's not the blood, it's not the no, it's really, it's kind of hokey actually, but not the split pea soup. That was very effective in its time, don't get me wrong, but the reason it was effective was because we bought the reality of those characters. If you ever watch a movie that's not a genre movie, it's just a conventional period piece or serious drama, and a character cuts her finger or stubs his toe, people jump. Right. Like, why does that? You're so used to watching people being beheaded and slaughtered and impaled in all these horror movies, and it has no effect on you. But that slightest little nick will affect you in a movie if you're taking the movie seriously, if you're invested in the movie. So when you're doing a genre movie, it's even more important because you really want it not to be just a series of replaceable teenagers getting killed, by a madman. So the characters come first, then you worry about the effects and the kills and so on.
Right. Well, one of the things you mentioned is that sort of idea of just like a whole bunch of teenagers getting killed off one by one. But the studios seem to do that well when the at least in this day and age, when the group of teenagers are known, actors from like TV shows and things like that. Is that necessary in the horror genre today? Like to really be successful, do you have to have those really A-list actors now, or can you still get away with just doing a genre piece without having these, A-list?
Horror movies are much less cast dependent. Yes, if they can afford and they will frequently go off of a TV actor who has some heat on him. But horror movies really are dependent on the actual story, the characters. Does the story work? Does it make sense? Is it scary? Right. So you can get by with actors that nobody's ever heard of if the movie's really good. Much more so than in a big kind of a Hollywood production. So yeah, I mean, studios like to, if they're going to put $20 million, $30 million, $40 million into a studio picture, they're going to have names in it. But horror movies generally, they're made for very little money. Right. And if they can grab somebody off of a hot TV series and stick them in the movie, then that's the way to go. So it's much less cast dependent. You have to get good actors, but they don't necessarily need to be name actors.
Okay. And one last thing for people who are emerging screenwriters right now, you had mentioned, like, for example, the Halloween Resurrection was something you got hired to. How does an up and coming screenwriter get hired to get a gig?
Well, you write. You write, and you write not what you think will sell, but what you're invested in artistically. That movie came off of a script that I'd written that was one of the most obscure literary so-called uncommercial scripts I've ever written. It was purely an exercise. There was a lot of language in it, which from Girl on the Train, and I tend to like. It was one of the least commercial scripts I've ever written in my life. It came to the attention of the producers of Halloween, and I was brought in because they liked. Now, Mustafa Akkad was an older gentleman at the time, and English is not his first language. His son was born here. His son is American, and the son loved the script. Mustafa, I don't know that he understood 10 words in the movie in the script. In fact, he told me that. He said, I don't really understand this, but I really like it. And that script led to the biggest job I ever got. And I didn't sit there thinking, what am I going to be able to sell? What's commercial? What is going to make money in the theater? It was a script I wanted to write. And the only advice that transcends time and individual, every career has its own trajectory, and the advice from one person is not going to apply to somebody else. But the one thing I think does apply is to write something that you believe in and not something that you think will have some effect down the road. And it certainly was the case in that particular picture. In that particular picture, a movie that I wrote purely because I wanted to write it led to me getting the biggest, most remunerative job I've ever had.
Cool. And if you want to see The Girl on the Train, where can we see it?
I think Netflix and iTunes, all of those normal, conventional kind of platforms. Take care.
Check out The Girl on the Train on Netflix, iTunes. Thanks to Larry Brand for coming out. We really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us today on BAFF Chats, and we'll see you next time.